Parents and children is a fundamental concept in Unity and many game engines. So let's make sure we spend some time focusing on it and making sure we understand it. When we create an object, it has a position. Its position is a number of units along an x-axis. But in order for these units to mean anything, they have to have a value, and their value has to be relative to some point in space, right? 0, 0, 0 is the point that every point in space is a distance away from that point. We call it the origin of the scene. So all these objects, all of their positions are measured as a certain distance away from this point, the world origin, which is right underneath this player object. So its position here, -5, -10, 70, or whatever it is, 20. What we're changing is the distance from the origin. Okay, yeah, you get it. When we parent an object to another object, I'm going to make a new object, and I'm going to put it over here. When I parent an object to another object, I can do this by dragging and dropping in the inspector. But watch what happens to my position on the right when I do so. I take thing and I drag it on top of, let me rename this to parent object. I take thing and I drag it onto parent object. Parent object exists. It has some position. No matter how large its 3D mesh is or whatever, it has just some concrete point of a position. Thing, this cube, is now defined as a certain number of units away from that parent. If I were to move the parent, thing would move with it. If I were to move thing, it would do its own thing. Let's try that. Thing 2. Let's make them both visually, make them both visible. So we're going to take thing and we're going to make it a child of thing 2. So watch the position here when I do that. Well, right, this position is -5, 1.820, and I drag and I drop -5.300. It changed, but the object didn't move, right? So we can see its position. If I unparent it, its position changes, but the object doesn't move. What's happening is this position is now not a number of units away from the origin, it's now a number of units away from the parent. And the parent is a number of units away from the origin. So every child, we just, we go, okay, I'm this far away from here, and you're that far away from there, so then I must be that far away from there. It sort of adds these vectors together. But now I can move the parent, and the object will move. I can rotate the parent, the object will move, and the child hasn't rotated, even though it is rotated in the scene. The child hasn't moved, even though it has moved in the scene, because as far as it is concerned, it doesn't even know the parent's rotated. It's just doing its thing. So we can group objects together as children. Let's look at that again, but over here on my whiteboard. It's a little bit easier to see in 2 dimensions and when we draw it all out with arrows. So if I take a Post-it note, I can define this Post-it note as having a point, right? And I can, the object that is our cube, our mesh, our sphere can be any size, but ultimately there is some point of the object that is that object's origin. And we can, let me just draw an actual X, Y axis here. I drew it too big. Okay. We can draw our X, Y axis here. And our point is some number of units away from the origin of 0, 0. Some 5, 4, whatever its position is, it's some distance away. When we parent an object, we are making a sort of a new coordinate system, and I can have a new object, another piece of paper. And this object can have its position a number of units away. I should have used another Post-it note, but they would both be pink, so it's not helpful. So I can define this object in terms of this coordinate system, and I can define this coordinate system in terms of this larger coordinate system, and the object to its parent doesn't change, even as I move it around, and even as I rotate it. I rotate the parent, this object is still 4 units on the x-axis, 3 units on the y-axis, right? So every transform can be thought of as it's like sort of its own coordinate system with its own scale. I can't scale paper. Maybe I can move it closer to the camera. Scale, rotation, and positions. Every transform can be thought of as its own coordinate system. When an object is relative to another object, we say whatever its most immediate parent is, we call that the local space. Whatever the outermost parent is, we call that the world space. Okay, I'll stop moving pieces of paper around. We'll head back into Unity to wrap up and to look at it again and to mention a couple of gotchas. And those gotchas are pretty simple. One, we often use game objects to organize things. We often use game objects to just keep things in order. And when we do that, we might take all these objects that are my environment and move them into my environment object. So I can take that and I can move the whole level I've created here around. But we want to be careful when we use objects to organize, because if I scale things here, it's going to get really wonky. It's not going to scale around its center. It's going to scale around its, some other point. Well, it's going to scale around the object's center. But we need to make sure that we take that object and we almost always want to, if it's just going to be an empty game object with children, we want to make sure its position is 0, 0, 0. That way, all of its children, as far as they are concerned, their coordinates are still the same as if they were in world space. And that's just going to save us some headache, is by zeroing out our parents. It's very common to have to make an empty parent and to accidentally leave it out in Canada, and then to say, okay, well, I'll make all my little obstacle cubes here, children of cubes, I'll call it. And then I go, great, but I want to make them all a little bit taller. I'll just scale up the parent or something. And I scale, and look, it flies left and right when I'm scaling it. It should be getting wider. It shouldn't be flying out to the left. And the reason it's doing that is because the object's parent is out over here. So they are scaling away from that origin point. So we generally don't want that. If you have a collection of objects, you probably want its parent to be like in the middle of those objects. Easier to see with this gizmos scaling happening around the center of the collected objects or around the pivot point. Sometimes it's helpful to have that, makes editing things easier. And here for rotation, global, local for rotating objects if they rotate around their center or around their pivot. Okay, lastly, was there everything I wanted to say? I think that was almost everything. Are there any other gotchas with parents? There's tons of it. We mess this stuff up all the time. I think the last thing I wanted to cover was global, local rotations and scaling. And I just did that already. So there you go. There it is. I've confused myself, but we got there in the end. I had already mentioned the things in the scene view. I don't like this new UI. I wish I could just press it once and it would switch, but it's whatever. Okay, bye.